My guest today is Lisa Napoli, and her journalistic credits include reporting for the New York Times, MSNBC, and Public Radio's Marketplace. And the most fascinating thing that I think I am waiting to hear about from Lisa is her novel that she's written, Ray and Joan, the man who made the McDonald's fortune and the woman who gave it all away. And I'm not really sure it's a novel. It's kind of like a biography more than anything else.
Yes.
But the thing is, I mean, I'm just wondering what people know about Ray and Joan today, in today's world. I mean, I grew up with this, so I'm very familiar, and I've always been fascinated by both of them. But this is out in a time of people who they know the Golden Arches and they know kind of the background, but they really don't know about the person. So what made you do this book?
Well, yes, and let me say that it isn't a novel. A novel, of course, is fictionalized, and this is not fictionalized one bit. This is the result of years of painstaking research. And I, like you, was curious about both these people, but I knew very little. And I found when I went to find out more that it was very hard to find out more than just a very surface level Google kind of information about them. So it was hard to find information about them because both people had carefully crafted mystiques around them. And I just set on this trail about 5 years ago because of a sculpture I found that Mrs. Kroc had funded here in Southern California that just seemed odd. It seemed very strange to me that she would fund a sculpture here, nowhere near where she lived. And that set me on this trail where I've spent years sleuthing down people, looking at archives, looking for old newspaper articles that were difficult to find because they were at a time when they aren't all digitized, and sort of stitching together the really interesting stories of not just how they met, but how the fortune was made and all of that. So I hope that answers or starts to answer your question.
Absolutely. Well, I guess it stimulates my curiosity. How did they meet?
Well, so they met in a most interesting way. They were both really excellent piano players, which of course is something that's sort of fallen by the wayside today, right? There was a time when people took piano
I never
lessons.
even knew that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, but many people back then took piano, and if they were good, they learned and crafted because that was part of entertainment at a party. You know, there had to be somebody in your crowd who could play an instrument, and both Ray and Joan were both excellent pianists. And Joan was playing organ in a very nice restaurant in St. Paul, Minnesota, where she was born. And Ray walked into this very nice restaurant to sell the owner of the restaurant a franchise of McDonald's, a very early franchise. And he was so taken by this woman who was 26 years younger, how skillful her piano playing was. That was something that was very impressive to him. And their relationship took off from there, although it took many years for them to get disentangled from their own spouses and to marry. And that's sort of the meat of this book, if you will. No pun intended.
Well, it's interesting because most of us, in my generation at least, know him as a billionaire fast food magnate who bought this little hamburger stand and developed it into this multi-billion-dollar industry. But, what attracted him and kept him attracted to Joan? Because, they were so different.
Right. They were so different, and yet they were very similar in the sense that they were both volatile, passionate personalities. And you know how sometimes that works and sometimes that doesn't work. And in their case, I think the fact that they were falling in love at a moment in time that was really exciting for both of them. For Ray, he was on the roller coaster of building this business, which came very close to falling apart many, many times. And for Joan, her husband had become involved with McDonald's too, not coincidentally. And he was building his fortune by starting his own franchise and then several more in Rapid City, South Dakota, where they'd moved to start McDonald's. There was a time, Gail, a lot of people don't remember this or realize this. There was a time when America wasn't filled with strip malls and booming suburbs. This was a time when all of that was being built because it was after the war. People were moving out to the suburbs, into bigger homes, having bigger families, buying cars, perhaps for the first time, and they had leisure time and they had families to go out and have fun with. And so McDonald's was propagated all around the country by Ray and his folks who literally flew over the beginnings of communities, and they would see the church and they would see the school and they would say, wow, we've got to put a McDonald's there. And so this was a really intoxicating time because the country was in this post-war boom. Joan was helping her husband build his mini empire in Rapid City, which was very exciting for them. They came into town, they built up this franchise. They built two more. People, got to know who they were. People were excited about McDonald's being there. And Ray was on the same trajectory. So it was very, very exciting. And I think that kind of cocktail of, no bad pun intended, because there were drinking issues that come later on, really, really helped sort of ferment this love affair.
Wow. Well, I guess that's one of the reasons why people need to read this book, because it goes into so many different facets of Ray and Joan. But she also, you said, that she risked her marriage and her reputation to promote controversial causes that she believed in.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, so what's interesting is that Ray and Joan, when they finally married in 1969, Joan found out pretty quickly, if she hadn't known before, that Ray was a big drinker. And he was a volatile drinker. And she made a decision. She had filed for divorce in 1971 and then rescinded the papers. And in the papers were some very incendiary accusations toward Ray about his volatile personality, his ungovernable temper, violent temper. And so Joan made the decision to stay in this marriage at a time in the 70s when McDonald's was like Apple is today. It was just the biggest company around, the hottest company around. And it was also very controversial too. And Joan decided to take her pain and instead of running from the marriage, staying in the marriage and using some of Ray's money to start an alcoholism education charity. Basically, what she did was she coalesced people who were at the beginning of this movement, which was just starting in earnest, where people were coming out and talking about addiction and addiction recovery and new ways of helping people find assistance to kick their addiction issues. And Joan worked with them very publicly. She made movies that aired across the country. She published books that were distributed. She put people on the Today Show as representative of her organization, got Dear Abby to write a column that produced an avalanche of requests for help pamphlets for people who needed to find help for family members who were afflicted with this disease. She was very, very public with that, but yet she never, ever said that Ray had a problem. Of course, all of the McDonald's executives who supported Ray and had been with him since the very beginning and had become very rich as a result of their association with him were on tenterhooks, hoping that she didn't say anything to out him. Because, of course, at that time, it's not a badge of honor to come out now as someone with an addiction problem, but it's certainly more societally acceptable to say that you have this problem. Then, of course, that was just a terrible strike against you to do that. So they were worried about that. And later, after Ray died, Joan was very, very vocal about things like she was the first person to give $1 million to the Democratic Party, the first individual to give $1 million to the Democratic Party. And that was after Ray died. And Ray had very famously supported Nixon. So it's just an interesting example of a woman today. It may not seem so radical, although I guess if a wife of a pronounced or a famous person steps out, so to speak, from his politics or his ideals, there's some question about that. But then, boy, that was unthinkable, and she really was risking a lot
Well, you've looked at both of their lives and how they intertwined, and I'm just curious. We can't deny the fact that he started an amazing movement of fast food. I mean, it was just amazing. I remember traveling with my kids. I don't think I've been in a fast food restaurant in a long time, but when I traveled with my husband and kids, if we saw those golden arches, that's where we went, because we knew what we were getting, and it was an easy, inexpensive way to feed everybody. And the one thing my husband used to always say was, they had the cleanest restrooms of anywhere you went. And so that was really important. But I'm curious about one thing, and that is, do you think that it takes a man with some kind of quirk, like alcoholism? I mean, it's not a quirk, it's a disease. Mm-hmm. But do you think it takes somebody like that, with that kind of passion for whatever it is that he's doing, bolstered by alcohol, to get where he got? I mean, you mentioned Apple, and certainly we know that Steve Jobs was quirky as well. I mean, do you think, did you see in your research that it took that kind of quirkiness to be able to build something like McDonald's?
Well, I think if you look historically, it takes somebody. I covered the .com revolution for the New York Times back when it was first beginning, and you could see the people who were passionate and dogged and determined versus the people who were just hitching a ride and trying to cash in on the flavor du jour. And the people who were passionate more often than not would triumph over the people who were just tagging along. And I think with Ray, it's important to mention that Ray did not start McDonald's. There were two men in the desert of California who started McDonald's, named McDonald, and Ray saw Ray saw in their system, which was a very fast movement. I mean, there were hamburger stands everywhere in the 50s, but what Dick and Mac McDonald did was they revolutionized the food preparation so that it moved so quickly that you could drive up and get a hamburger very quickly that was good. And yes, cleanliness was a huge portion of it. And then Ray came along, and Ray loved the system. He wanted to franchise it. They didn't. They were happy with the money they were making because they were making plenty of money. They didn't want the hassle. He said he would do it. He started to do it. And then he started to do it and collided with a man who so fervently believed in his model of franchising, a man named Harry Sonnenborn, that together with Ray, they developed the system that made McDonald's possible. At the same time, there were many other people who were starting to take their hamburger stands and propagate them around the lands. But what made McDonald's succeed was partially its cleanliness. Ironically, partially the fact that the food was so good. In the early days, the food was not mass produced. It was sourced locally. All of the McDonald's had prescriptions, if you will, for how to source the food locally and prepare it to exacting standards, including the French fries. And then from there, what Harry Sonnenborn and Ray did that really set them apart was that they came up with a formula that made it possible for McDonald's, the corporation, to own the real estate on which the McDonald's, the Golden Arches, were built. And because of that complex real estate system, that's why McDonald's triumphed. All the other things about McDonald's helped. Again, it was a perfect cocktail of moments. They had this fabulous look that Dick McDonald had created, these arches that were very distinctive. They had this idea of having carefully outfitted people, men only, working in a kitchen, moving things along quickly. They were very insistent on cleanliness around the building and not having car hops and jukeboxes and cigarette machines, which many other hamburger stands at the time had. And those kinds of things turned off families, which is exactly why your family, when you were tooling around the roads, decided to go into McDonald's, or not. At that point, you couldn't go in. There was just a way to sit around the edge of it. People knew that it was a family-friendly place, and everything was about sort of directing things for a family to make it comfortable. So it was just this perfect moment in time, and they did such a fantastic